You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Zach Bechtold and Matt Franks. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast and check us out online at beardedtheologians.com. You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Matt Franks
and Zach Bechtold. And today we have a special guest with us. We have Jorge Acevedo, who is the lead pastor at Grace Church, which is a United Methodist Church in Southwest Florida. George, we're glad to have you on, and thanks for the time being here. Would you start us off and tell us a little bit about yourself and your ministries?
Okay. I am a grateful follower of Jesus and a pastor, privileged to be a United Methodist pastor in the Florida Conference of the United Methodist Church, and I've been serving here for 21 years, so it's been a good run ministry, and we've got a couple of sites, but I tell people, don't think of the kind of the mega church, multi-sites, and we do have 5 campuses. But the campuses are primarily in working class, blue collar, working poor, and very poor communities. And then something that we're pretty excited about that's getting a lot of traction. We've been learning a lot from the Anglicans and the Methodists in the UK, and we're doing a lot of work with Fresh Expressions. And so we've launched a couple of dinner churches, and we have a couple of ministries that we're transforming into Fresh Expressions of church. To create new spaces and places. That's kind of on the ministry work side. I'm married to Cheryl. Next Monday will be 36 years, and so it's a good long run. And we have 2 adult sons, one who's 33 and married and has given us 4 beautiful grandkids. And then I have a younger son who's 29, who is a chef in training, an amazing young man named Nathan. And so we love living here in Southwest Florida. It's a beautiful part of God's world. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing about that. I got to had the pleasure to meet you earlier this year in New Mexico, and just kind of sit and pick your brain about a lot of this stuff. And while you were out there, you talked about your relatively new book. It came out earlier this year. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. We got approached by our denominational press, Abington, to write a book, and I pitched to them the idea that one of the pastors here and I have known each other for more than 30 years. He was in my youth group when I was in seminary, and he's now a pastor on our staff. And so we have this very cool, symbiotic kind of ministry relationship that kind of dates back from youth ministry to some internships, and now together here for the last 12 years at this site. And he and I had done a series of messages around the Wesleyan understanding of grace, this whole idea of prevenient and justifying, sanctifying. And there's this other aspect of grace that we Wesleyans believe in, glorifying grace. So we had done a series of messages of sermons here, and that sermon series then got translated into a book and a DVD called A Graceful Life. We just kind of basically walked through the reality that all of life is under this amazing umbrella of grace, whether we know it or not, that we live under the amazing unmerited love of God for us all, that from the cradle to the grave, from the womb to the tomb, from our first breath to our very last breath, that we live under grace. And we talked about how it is that we experience these different dynamics or aspects of grace. And so it was a fun project, and it seems to be helping people across the church. And we're hearing good reports about how it's just kind of opening new portals for people to understand God's grace in a fresh and a new way.
So, it's a group study and kind of a sermon series thing. And you said you've heard of some great success. Do you have any stories of anybody that has shared with you the experience that's made with them, or from maybe even from the sermon series itself that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, when we, for example, when we talk about prevenient grace, we kind of came up with this idea that if you use one of the greatest words in the Bible is the word even. And you kind of look at that word and kind of do a little word study on that word. And we discovered that prevenient grace, this wooing grace, this drawing grace of God, we called it even their grace. That Psalm 139 says, "Where can I go from your presence? I go to the heights of heaven, you are there. Go to the depths of hell, you are there. It doesn't matter where we go, even there, your grace finds me." I think that's one of the most important understandings, biblical understandings that we have of who God is and about how God would. We kind of get somebody loving us because we love them. There's this kind of reciprocal thing, but this amazing idea that the God of the universe, the creator of the universe, is crazy in love with us and is loving us even long before we recognize God's love for us. I talked about we talk about in the book how hard it is even for those of us who are followers of Jesus to embrace that, and that God's love is not simply for those who love Him back. So for example, when I was in Costa Rica, I was preaching at a seminary there in Costa Rica to a bunch of village pastors in the Methodist Church. I'd been invited there to do a week of instruction, and I was teaching about prevenient grace, and I said that there had been people in our church here in Southwest Florida who had come to Christ in some very odd and different places. We've had people come to Christ in strip clubs, in bars, and those kinds of places. And you got to understand Latino culture. It's God and His presence and His power is pretty localized. There's this great understanding that God's at work in the church, but not so much in a bar. And so I know Spanish enough to make me dangerous, and I said, "El Señor está ahí," which means the Lord is there. And I was trying to say, "El Señor está en la barra," in the bar. The Lord is in the strip clubs. The Lord is, and they were looking at me like, "Dude, we're not buying what you're selling." I was getting, nah, they're leaning back like, "Okay, here comes a heretic," and I'm dying 1,000 deaths up there. And finally, this guy in the back of the room raises his hand. That kid's song, one of these things is not like the other. Right. This guy raises his hand from the back of the room, and he was the one of them that was not like the other. The others were dressed in these little guayaberas, these little formal shirts or suits and ties. This guy was tattooed, full beard. You guys would have liked him. Harley jacket, and he stood up and he said, "Can I testify?" And I said, "Please, rescue the preacher. He's dying up here." And he got up and he told the story about how he had been drinking one night in a bar in Mexico. He was the leader of a motorcycle gang in Costa Rica, and he had been drinking in a bar one night. As he came out of the bar, he said, "One of those stupid Christians handed me one of their stupid tracts," and I grabbed it and threw it in my backpack and jumped on my Harley, drove away. He said several months later, I'm in a bar in Costa Rica. I pour my last drink out of the bottle of rum that I drunk that whole day. And I went upstairs to pull the gun out of the bag that I had to blow my brains out because I had no hope for living. He said, instead, I reached in there and I pulled out this little tract, And he said, I began to read it. And he said, it made sense that the God of the universe loved me and would give me a new start and a fresh start. And he said, I became a Christian that day in the top room above a bar in Costa Rica. And then he said, El Señor está ahí, the Lord is there. And all across the room, everybody, yeah, the Lord is there, the Lord is there. And I think that that's kind of a powerful illustration as to that God is at work in our life long before we know that God's at work in our life. That God is trying to woo us and draw us into a relationship with Himself, and we sometimes miss that. I know God's even their grace better when I kind of turn around and look back at God's grace in our life. And so, those kinds of stories, the book's made up of a lot of those kinds of stories about prevenient grace, this wooing, drawing grace, justifying grace, that whether it happens in a moment or over a season, when we come to that sense that we want to give as much of ourselves as we can to as much of God as we understand, and make that decision to follow Christ. And then the sanctifying grace, which we kind of sometimes lift up as a hallmark of ours as followers of Jesus in the Wesleyan way. And then finally, glorifying grace, which is interesting. I never preached the message on God's glorifying grace, this grace of God that takes us from life into death. And I was sad to say that in my, right at 30 years of ministry, I don't ever remember preaching a sermon on that. I had preached sermons about heaven and all that, but never talked about glorifying grace. And I did research, and in the research I discovered that Charles Wesley's doctor said to Charles of the early Methodists, "You Methodists die well." And there was this sense of assurance that we had. It's ironic that, for John Wesley, a big part of what drove him to Aldersgate in that experience was that he was afraid of death on that boat trip from Georgia back to England. And so that's been a rich part of our Wesleyan heritage, this idea that we can live at peace even as we transition from life temporal to life eternal, and that there's this grace that carries us through. So yeah, it was a fun project, and the DVD is really Wes and I, this other pastor that we co-authored the book, kind of just sitting at a table and having conversation with each other, kind of new material. It leads into some questions and answers for small groups.
And I think that's the thing as maybe Methodists believing in these doctrines of grace, and as pastors, we do poorly, is telling the story. We like to talk about, grace is there, grace is with us, there's prevenient and sanctifying, and yet we don't back it up with those stories. And so having those stories of somebody standing up in the back going, "Hey, let me tell you how grace is working in my life," those are huge.
Yeah.
Because, as well as we do, even sitting here in our congregations, we can say, "Hey, we're seeing people in the coffee shop, in the bar, in the grocery store, and here's how grace is working in their lives," and they're going, "Well, it's here. It's here in the church, not there." And each Sunday I tell my church, "Go, please go." Leave this place, and take this grace and love with you, but bring those stories back. And so we've gotten really bad about not telling the story.
Zach, I sometimes will, when I'm invited to speak in different environments, I'll say, of our tribe, of our Methodist tribe, I'll say, we believe in prevenient grace. We just do ministry like we don't believe in prevenient grace.
Right.
And, sadly, we think it only happens in that room, from 10 to 11 or from 11 to 12, instead of recognizing that, there's a lot of grace in cinema. My wife and I, we just went to see Justice League, and I don't know if either of you've gotten to see it yet, but it's a great. I'm an old comic book guy, and it's just a great. You got to go see Batman, and it's interesting that the themes of this epic movie are the Trinity, resurrection, salvation, and community, and mission. I mean, I'm going like, dude, they're telling our story better than we tell our story,
Right.
And that's grace. I mean, that's God's grace at work. Again, whether the cinematographers recognize it or not, they are grabbing the great themes out of this book, the Bible. Mm-hmm. They're grabbing the great themes out of this book, and sometimes, sadly, and many times, telling it better than we do. Telling the story, to your point, Zach, telling the story. And we got to get better at just telling the story, particularly the story as it relates outside of the four walls of the church. Because many people outside of the walls of the church are not going to connect to the story that we tell out of this book, but they'll connect to the story. They can engage into God's story as they hear God's story in your life. In every, whether it's at the softball field or whatever, which ironically, I don't know if we want to transition into this fresh expressions thing. It's really been a gift to our church. For decades, I've been here 2 decades, more than 2 decades in the same community. And I've busted my hindquarters along with a large group of people here to try to do things out in the community that draws people into the doors of the church here. And, we've even gotten pats on the backs and accolades for doing it pretty well. But ironically, there are generations, particularly of millennials, that it doesn't matter what you do out there to draw them in here, and even how cool it is in here. You can have the best lights and sound and smoke machines and the greatest sermons and, bring in personalities and all the rest. They're just not going to come. They're just not interested. For a whole host of reasons that we probably don't have time to get into today, but they're just not interested. So, I think we have a spiritual and missional obligation to figure out how we can make coffee shops and pool halls and bars and community centers and little gazebos and parks into little missional communities, and value that. And value that people are going to move at a different pace around this journey of grace in their life. We're starting to experiment with it, and we're seeing some remarkable results. That this grace isn't just for this place, but that this grace is out there at work, that God is bigger than the little boxes that we sometimes put God in.
Right. I've got we're beginning to work that way in my new appointment. I've got 3 churches, and one of them's in a community that's shrunk to under 200 people. They lost their school a couple of years ago, and so that's really shrunk the community down to where it's our church and the bar. Those are the 2 open facilities during the week. Wow. And I've started gathering my people in this little bar, and we had a Bible study last week of about 10 people, all over the age of 60, in this bar. And one of my members at one of my bigger churches, or my bigger church, got a phone call from a lady up the road and said, "Hey, how do you like your pastor? I understand he's new. How do you like him?" And she said, "Oh, we like him pretty good." And she said, "Do you know where he's doing Bible study?" She said, "Yeah, he's doing it up at the bar." And she said, "Yeah, I know. I'm going next time they have it." And so, it's getting out of that, and people respond in fascinating ways.
Yeah. Well, again, if we really, if we think carefully about what we believe about prevenient grace, it really is that the God of the universe, that we understand as the triune God, is at work in every human being.
Right.
One of my favorite stories to try to communicate what prevenient grace is I had a buddy that was an accountant in Louisiana, and he, like myself, he's a grandfather. And there's something about being grandfathers. You 2 guys are way too young for this, but I'm just telling you, being a grandfather is so much better than being a father. You sugar them up and you send them home, you know what I mean? And you just get to spoil them, and it's cool. It's kind of revenge for your own kids and the kind of the hell they caused you when they were growing up. So we were talking one day, and he was telling me about his new grandson named Paxson. And Paxson was born prematurely, and you guys know, your pastors, often premature babies have lungs that aren't fully formed, so they put them in those incubators. They're kind of made of plexiglass. You have to put gloves on or a hazmat suit to hold them, kind of deal, because they're so sensitive. And he said he was going to the hospital every day to see his grandson Paxson, and he said it didn't satisfy. I could hear his southern drawl. Did not satisfy my sensibilities as a grandfather. And he was telling about how he said, "But I have learned this of my grandson. My grandson Paxson's crazy about me. He just doesn't know it yet." And and I pondered on that, and I thought, that's the condition of every person on this planet as it relates to God. They're crazy about Jesus. They just don't know it yet. And that's prevenient grace, that there is this, N.T. Wright calls it this echo of a voice. Blaise Pascal, God-shaped vacuum. St. Augustine talked about this sense of our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. Well, whatever language you use, talk about it, is this sense that the God of the universe has more at stake in this thing of people engaging with his grace than we do. One of the things I love about our Wesleyan theology is we don't think grace shows up when we show up. We believe that grace is already at work, and we just get to come alongside what God in his grace is already doing in this planet. And so that can happen in a bar.
Mm-hmm.
That can happen in a strip club. That can happen in that can happen in a baseball diamond. That can happen in those kinds of places. But I think what Fresh Expressions has done for us is helped us rethink our strategy, because our strategy was, let's go out there and let's do some cool stuff. But the idea was still to draw them into this place.
Right.
To be able to validate that the bar where you're meeting at with that group of people is a place of discipleship every bit as much as the church down the street that you pastor as well. And that's been the piece that's been kind of liberating for us, is to say, no, we don't get to count them on Sunday morning worship attendance, we just count them in another category. And we're figuring out ways to walk with people every bit as deliberately in their discipleship in those environments as we are in small groups and Sunday schools and the other kinds of what we call more traditional stuff that we do in the church. Yeah,
and I found it. I was thinking of one story for me. This last year, I started reffing Little League basketball games. That's and cool. The first couple of days of the tournament, it was a little rough. People said things to me that you probably would never utter to a pastor if you knew they were a pastor. And then all of a sudden, I was reffing Saturday, which is Champion Saturday, and it's one of the more hostile environment Saturdays. I knew this coming in. I'd reffed a couple turns before, and so I was ready to take my blows and to hear all the words. And then finally, I went up and talked to this coach after the game, who happened to be a brother of another United Methodist pastor they looked exactly alike. And I said, "Hey, do you know this guy?" And he's like, "Yeah, I know this guy. That's my brother." And I said, "Oh, I love that guy. We work together in all these things. I'm the United Methodist pastor here in town." And after that game, I guess word spread that that's what I do, because the conversation and timbre of the room changed. Oh yes, I was told when I made a mistake, but it was kind of funny to hear, we didn't have to feel like we had to throw anybody out. We didn't feel like but it was kind of fun that was happening. And the guy that I was reffing with, he leaned over to me in between one games. He said, "What's going on?" I said, "I think they found out I'm a pastor and they're afraid to say anything now." He just sat there and laughed. And part of me thinks that whole idea of presence, whether it's like one of the things I love doing, and it's something that I started when I got here, is we have a group of men that get together on Wednesday morning for a Bible study, breakfast and Bible study. And, just that whole idea of presence, of being, present, but letting people know that, hey, this is who we are. This is what we're doing. We're having Bible study in a bar. We're having Bible study at a breakfast joint. We're getting together to pray with each other at a gazebo in town. I was working on a proposal for our farmers market that we have here in town to do communion at our farmers market, and getting people equipped to show that grace exists outside of the walls of the church. And George, I thank you for doing that and lifting that up, for us, because that's something that I feel like the church needs to hear. And we can preach it, we can preach it in the pulpit on Sunday morning, but the real reality is can we model that outside of the wall? Can we model that in our jobs and equipping people and saying, yes, you can do this. And that's something that we've really been focusing on here, is that to equip people to go out in the community and knowing that, ministry exists, in their jobs, whether they're school teachers or retired, and that there are ways to be active and involved. And we've really found that life-giving around here. Just that simple, and some of it's just simple permission giving. The pastor just saying, yes, go out into the community and serve. And I think that's a huge thing.
Thank you for listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast. We hope you've enjoyed listening, and we hope that you share our content online through Facebook and social media, and we hope that you check out our Beardcast store at beardedtheologians.com and pick up some great Bearded Theologians gear. We hope you have a good day.